She had stopped screaming hours ago. Her voice was gone, swallowed by the sea. The ship groaned beneath her as if it too resented the weight of its cargo. Hundreds of bodies, shackled, sweating, praying to gods who could no longer hear them. The air below deck was thick with the sour stench of blood, salt and rot. The wood dripped with condensation and misery. Somewhere in that darkness, a young woman named Abina lay curled on her side, her wrists raw from the iron biting her skin. She had once been a daughter, a wife, someone's entire world. Now she was inventory. They brought her on deck at dawn. The sun bled over the horizon, staining the waves red. "Dance," the sailor barked. The women obeyed because refusal meant pain. Chains clanked to a rhythm that mocked every beat of her heart. The officers watched with the same hollow amusement men reserve for broken things. To them, this was a routine, a ritual of control. To her, it was the death of her soul. When one officer's gaze lingered, Abena felt the danger shift in the air. He smiled, the kind that promised harm, and before night fell, she learned what it meant to be owned twice, first by the chain, then by desire. By the time the ship reached the Caribbean, her body no longer felt like her own. On the shore, white men waited with coins in their fists and cruelty in their eyes. The women were lined up, inspected like livestock. A man pressed his thumb into her hip, another forced open her mouth to see her teeth. They argued over her age, her weight, her worth. She was sold to a man who smelled of rum and gunpowder, and just like that, her name vanished into his ledger. Abena became property, a number on a page traded for sugar and silver. The plantation was a place where daylight felt like punishment. The sun burned, the cane fields sliced skin like blades, and the overseer's whip cracked like thunder. Men and women worked side by side, but their suffering was never equal. The men endured the lash, the women endured that, and everything that followed after dusk. The master's house gleamed white against the horizon, a monument to civility built on screams. Inside, the women cooked, cleaned, and raised the children of the very men who had destroyed them. At night, footsteps echoed down hallways, soft and certain. Every creak of the floorboards could mean a beating, a demand, or another night stolen from her. When the master came to her room, she stared at the ceiling and left her body behind. He called her beautiful, like it was a compliment. He called it love, as if affection could bloom in a cage. His wife knew, of course. They always did. But white silence was part of the system, a tradition passed down like the plantation itself. As long as the house stayed quiet, as long as the books balanced and the crops came in, the rest was ignored. When Abina's belly began to swell, the whispers started. The master arranged for her to be moved to another estate. The wife wanted no reminders of her husband's sins. By the time the child was born, she was already gone, sold again to a man who cared only for her hands and her womb. Generations would follow, each repeating the same unholy pattern. Women forced to bear the children of their masters, their own offspring growing up to serve the same house that broke them. In the ledgers it was called natural increase. To the women it was a curse with no name. Some chose not to bring another life into that world. They whispered of herbs hidden in the fields, roots that could end a pregnancy before it began. It was an act of defiance disguised as despair. Others endured, clinging to small mercies, a song from home, a glimpse of the moon, a stolen moment with another enslaved soul who reminded them what tenderness felt like. Love, in such a place, was rebellion. Abina lived long enough to see her daughter grow into the same kind of danger she'd known. The girl was barely 13 when the master began to notice her. One night, Abina stood outside the house and listened to the familiar sound of her child's cries muffled behind closed doors. Something inside her broke for the final time. In that instant, she understood what it meant to live in a world that devoured its women whole. She prayed not for salvation, but for an ending. She would die on that island, her story buried beneath the sugar cane, but the echoes of her life would ripple outward, across time, across oceans, refusing to die. Years passed. Slavery ended, they said. Chains were broken, papers signed, freedom declared. But freedom meant little when the same laws that once named a woman property now called her dangerous. The world changed its costume, but not its script. The daughters of Urbana walked unshackled, yet still watched, still touched without consent, still judged for their bodies. The same lie that once excused the master's violence, that black women were born sinful, that they wanted what was done to them, survived, written now in headlines, in songs, in the sideways glances of men who believed they were civilized. In the fields of the American South, the plantations became prisons by another name. Under Jim Crow, the same soil that had soaked up centuries of blood sprouted new forms of cruelty. Black women were sterilized without consent, studied by doctors who saw them as specimens, not patients. The hospitals were cleaner than the ships had been, but the cold indifference was the same. White men in white coats called it progress. History called it repetition. They said it was for science. They said it was mercy. It was neither. It was control wearing a lab coat instead of a whip. The world moved forward and found new ways to disguise the old sins. The movies came, the newspapers, the stories that painted black women as temptresses, wild and unrestrained. The same men who had written laws and led sermons now wrote scripts that made their violence look like romance. The Jezebel was born, not a woman, but a caricature, a lie that excused centuries of exploitation. It said black women could not be violated because they were already impure, because desire lived in their blood. The world believed it, because believing was easier than admitting guilt. But through every century of silence, there were voices that refused to die. Women who wrote, who preached, who shouted their truth into a world that tried to hush them. Maria W. Stewart stood before a crowd in 1833 and asked the question that still pierces the air today. What if I am a woman? The words were simple, but they carried the weight of every scream ever stifled, every story buried, every body broken and unacknowledged. What if I am a woman? Not an object, not a symbol, not a vessel for someone else's sin, but a human being with a soul? The question haunts every history book that tried to erase them. It lives in the eyes of every daughter who carries that ancestral memory, of oceans crossed, of pain endured, of strength unbroken. To speak their names is to resurrect them. Urbana, Marie, Louise, Sally. Women who lived in the shadow of power but refused to vanish entirely. They are the ghosts that linger in the corners of museums, in the hymns sung on Sundays, in the quiet resilience of black womanhood that the world still cannot fully explain. Their stories are not just tragedy, they are testament, proof that survival itself can be sacred. Tonight, when you look at the world that pretends the past is gone, remember that it never left. It lingers in the cracks of institutions, in the whispered justifications, in the way certain bodies are still policed, still feared, still fetishized. History is not a graveyard, it's a mirror, and if you look long enough, you will see the reflection of every ship that ever set sail, every woman forced to dance on its deck, every child born into captivity and told to call it home. Urbana's story is not written in the books, it's written in bloodlines, in the quiet endurance of generations who refused to disappear. Her voice may have been silenced by the sea, but her echo remains, in every heartbeat of those who carry her legacy. The horror was real, the suffering unimaginable. But the survival, that was the miracle the world never counted on.